morning to our Thailand members and good afternoon to our Australian members. Welcome to AustCham Thailand's webinar. Today we're looking at BDO's Global Risk Landscape Report for 2021. Certainly now more than ever, the uncertainty we're facing in the world, being on top of risk assessment is imperative for every business and indeed individuals. I'd like to welcome our speakers for today, Peter Sheville, partner at BDO Thailand, and Sean Pascoe, partner at BDO Australia. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, Brendan, for the opportunity to present today. I think I'll just send over to Sean as well, just to, if you want to do a quick intro to yourself, Sean.
Yeah, so good afternoon from me. Was it Sawadi Krupp? I always get that wrong, but I tried. So I've actually a partner in Sydney office doing consulting and risk type work, experience in IT across a whole number of areas, including business continuity, which pandemics relate to. So hopefully I can share some insights and knowledge.
No worries. And I'm Peter. I've been in Thailand for about nearly coming on 3 years now. So and obviously background in Australia as well. Did a lot of risk and advisory work in Australia, and doing some here as well as some other things as well. Thank you again for the opportunity, Brendan, to present some insights into the report today. Okay, so BDO released a report recently, the Global Risk Landscape Report. And today we're going to have a particular focus on APAC. They broke the report across 3 segments, being Europe, the Americas, and APAC as well. Now, whilst we'll provide some insights into the report today, we're also going to provide our own thoughts and our own observations from a Thailand, as well as an Australian perspective, of things that we think you might want to be thinking about as well. And in addition, Sean's had some broader insights into APAC generally, given his role in Australia. He leads the APAC Risk Advisory group, which gets together on a monthly basis to talk all things risk. So there might be some perspectives from his interactions across APAC more broadly. I think the key thing today that the report highlighted was that companies have found that through the COVID-19 pandemic, and the reality is in Australia and Thailand, I think maybe we're really getting hit with it now, but this has resulted in increased focus on risk management frameworks, more scrutiny of how effective they are, how they work, how they're being used. The APAC results also highlighted that executives that do embrace risk and maximise the use of technology and innovative solutions, and just as importantly, also empower their people, can build agile businesses that are fit for the future. So not only was the benefit of being agile, embracing risk, adapting technology, help them get through the pandemic, it also set them up for the future as well. So as I mentioned before, we know in Thailand right now we're experiencing a major outbreak, and the longevity and the severity, I think, now is going to be much greater than what we've faced last year, and in fact it already is. So we can actually learn some lessons from other countries in the region and globally who have been hit probably harder over the year or the last year and a half. Australia's also likewise seen a major spike, and Sean, I might get you to talk about your observations there from an Australian point of view about what is it like now, and what do you think the impacts will be, just from a point of view of the fact that Australia has been relatively free as well. There's some similarity.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because if I look back at SARS back in the early 2000s, Australia wasn't really impacted by it, but we did learn a few lessons from Asian countries in terms of the lockdowns and quarantine. I felt last year when we had then obviously COVID, the government was a lot more prepared and actually activated things a lot quicker. The trouble is though, while we actually pretty well virtually eradicated COVID, I think people relaxed some of the social distancing and other rules sort of, weren't adhered to, and we didn't control our quarantine hotels as strong as we probably should have, because we were in a bit of a sense of false security. It then jumped out again. And then, of course, with the Delta strain, which is a lot stronger, we're finding it's actually taking a hold a lot quicker. So we're probably going in the same situation as Thailand, where we've handled it well, then we've relaxed, and now we're paying for it. So at the moment, the only way out that the government can see, and even though the numbers are still small relative to other countries, is to actually do the vaccinations. And you'll find, also, in terms of talking to my colleagues in the other countries in Asia Pacific, they're actually going through a similar situation. Singapore, Malaysia, very similar. They've probably had a lot more lockdowns than we have, but we've almost joined the queue now, and we're learning from them and what they've done.
What was the impact? I think the impacts, the report found the impacts of the pandemic were actually worse than expected. 1 in 4 respondents agreed their company did not actually adapt very well. So it's 25% in the APAC region, which actually is similar to the global result as well. Nearly 50% of executives, both in APAC and internationally, globally, felt it was much worse than what they expected. If you looked at April 2020, when it was sort of early days in many respects, when they looked back and went, well, actually, it was a lot worse than we thought it would be, the impacts. The major pressure points that were identified through the survey was that technology was the big one. 43% in the APAC region said this was a major pressure point in terms of their infrastructure and ability to work remotely. And we'll be quite familiar that people had to adjust very quickly to a new regime and needed the technology to be able to do that. The other big impact was people and culture. So not only are you need the technology, you had all of a sudden new environments for people to have to work within, and they found that was impacting on low employee satisfaction, about 45%, as well as well-being. And then also internal cultural issues were highlighted as well, about 30%, in terms of the ability for organisations to move to rapid decision-making and trust or empowering people. I think that was the key that was highlighted from an impact point of view.
In Australia, for example, we actually had a bit of a wave of businesses outsourcing and moving technology into the cloud. I think that was actually quite good and good foresight. So it saved a lot of businesses, but there have been some high-profile businesses where old school management of, you're in the office, you've got to be seen in the office, no connections to home. A lot of those businesses actually went out of business and got sold off because they couldn't operate and therefore had no other alternative.
Yeah, and that's something we'll sort of explore a little bit further too, because I think it's the heart of empowering people. I have personal experience with BDO here in Thailand. The fact that we made a decision very early to be able to work anywhere, anytime, using cloud technology, it actually had very limited impact in terms of infrastructure. We'd already made the investment. But likewise in Thailand, if businesses had not prepared for that, it was a much harder slog, and there was a lot of issues that came out of that for those businesses as well. So the response actually, which is interesting in Thailand, in APAC, I should say, really focused on the technology response. And so 83% of organisations, in fact, a major response basically was the technology, but an interesting observation, a major response wasn't necessarily on the people so much in the APAC region, which I think in the European region was much bigger focus. But what's also interesting is those who didn't adapt well, nearly all of them compared that uncertainty was a factor in, or deliberately waiting for a more certain outcome or clarity, meant they didn't respond well. And I think if we follow the theme that Sean just talked about, that people trying to just keep the way things were and not adapting struggled a lot more. So I get a sense that people were like rabbits caught in the spotlights or in the headlights of a car. They just froze. We'll wait until something happens. So that's where people didn't adapt. The whole concept of risk is dealing with uncertainty, which if you cut down to the actual factors in them freezing, was that they weren't confident in their own risk management or being able to manage risk effectively. Sean, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, only from the point of view that most companies that did have pandemic plans or business continuity plans in place, they only struggled when they hadn't considered the impact of, say, technology. And as you mentioned before, being able to keep their office running in a virtual environment, which makes working from home a lot easier. Prior to COVID, I mean, logging on from home wasn't that easy. But obviously, when COVID hit, someone's opened up the gateway and made it a lot easier to operate. Whether that was restrictions and controls around security or access, or they were trying to manage it, I'm not sure. But the reality is, the infrastructure was there, we were able to use it. And I think that's where a lot of businesses are actually being able to survive, because it doesn't matter where you work from. As long as the technology can connect you, then you already got a big head start.
That's right. I think one of the risks that actually came out, and quite aware with where organisations had to adapt quickly, where they were largely still fairly paper-based to a large extent. They didn't really have remote technology. They started to put in workarounds on remote access, which exposed them to cyber risk as well, because it was sort of a plug-in fit that they had to do. So it led to other risks emerging in this area, but also other opportunities, as we've seen where organisations said, well, we've got to invest. They've created new technological responses that they can actually adapt and take forward in a new way of working. In terms of the looking at what did the companies that were successful, what did they do? Now, most companies actually did have, who were handled it well, actually had a pandemic listed on their risk register. And in my experience, looking at many organisations and companies over the years of risks, you see those sort of things sitting on a risk register. Could be a pandemic or a natural disaster, the impacts of those things. And you think, I wonder if that'll ever happen. Well, it did. It helped organisations. Pandemic has happened, and they felt that helped them. Now, that's not necessarily surprising if you think about it, that if you've actually done effective analysis and developed an effective response, which is at the heart of your risk assessment. It's not just having a register, it's actually what you've done and you've captured it on a register. Then you're more likely to have a better outcome. You're more likely to respond appropriately, more efficiently, quickly, and those sort of things. And the other thing the risk register can do for you is you're allocating responsibility for those risks. So the risk eventuates, then you know who needs to do what, and you put that into action. And you're starting to then, obviously you've got a business continuity plan that comes out of that as well. Now, some of the risks will relate to business continuity, other risks will not relate to continuity, but you're going to have a pretty good view of what they were. So I think that was a key one that came out. And from a personal thing, that I felt that was actually very sensible and expected outcome, I would have thought. The ability to have clear ownership, I think, is very important. The ability to make decisions quickly. So rapid response and decision making was another key for success. We talked a little bit before about people being rabbits caught in the headlights of a car, like they froze. Those who didn't freeze, who were able to respond quickly, who were able to make decisions quickly, were much more successful through that process. Now, if we look at the other factor, was that the empowerment of your people. Now, this is a trust issue. Do you trust your people? Sean raised the issue before that the old traditional, I've got to see the people in the office, for example, or in front of me to know that they're working. Those that try to stick with that struggled a lot more and were not as successful. Those that empowered the people, gave them trust to do the right thing, allowed them to work home, and then provided them the technology as much as possible, fared much better. And I actually do think that there's a lesson in that you can take forward in terms of your business models. the other thing I think with that is that there wasn't a culture of blame. You allowed people to make decisions. You allowed, because decision making can involve risk, it can involve mistakes, but empower people to make decisions with the right frameworks, and then supporting changes that need to happen to decision making. I don't know if you want to add to that one, Sean.
Yeah, it's a good point, Peter, because with the empowering of people, they found that by trusting employees, the productivity increased by over 20 to 25%. So that was a big push in itself. On your first point there about the pandemic and the risk register, where I found a lot of, I suppose, valuable information was where they used root cause analysis in their risk register around the pandemic risk. It actually helped to quantify specifically where the vulnerabilities lie and what they need to do in terms of strategies. So it actually helped them to build their business continuity plans out in a lot more detail rather than just as a generic risk.
Absolutely. And I think, what it's really highlighted to me as well as saying, those who are involved in risk could look at risk registers and they see things like pandemic and you think, well, that's never going to happen. I've been looking at this for 20 years or 30 years and then all of a sudden there is a pandemic, and that's why you have it, because it can wipe out your business. So I think the key thing to highlight now is, so for Thailand, we're seeing a massive escalation in the numbers. We're actually seeing the lessons learned, or the technology shifts may have happened, but now we've got this big risk around our people falling ill. The numbers are quite dramatic in Thailand. And I think everyone knows someone who's been affected, either personal, certainly. I think my case, I know absolutely people personally affected, their families affected directly. So there's another element of continuity planning that really needs to be thought through, and that's around people being out of action. And then also, not just from a continuity point of view, but also what's your proactive things that we're doing. So, for example, I've seen many companies supporting vaccination programs in Thailand because it's not necessarily easy to get a vaccination and it costs. Then also there might be EAP considerations or employee assistance programs, I think, for people who are struggling. So whilst you've got a business continuity element, you've got the caring for your people element that you need to be thinking about, particularly in Thailand at this time. I don't know if there's a different perspective there from Australia, Sean.
No, I think it's the same. I think where the global risk landscape report sort of highlighted too was that the executives see a lot more linkages back to risk management and to decision making. And I think that a lot of risk registers are not designed at the moment to do that. They're more of a historical capture of information rather than helping to drive some of those decisions that need to be done, because it's actually there, it's being clearly articulated, and it can be used going forward.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things I saw this, it was just last week actually in our own business, was that my fellow partner in the BSO area was talking business continuity, and she put it on the table saying, we need to do certain things here, which was great. That showed some great foresight, but more around the people, because we were fine on the technology. So it's that interaction of people in the senior parts of the business starting to talk about, well, what are the sort of things that we need to now adapt to, because risk is ever evolving and issues will also be evolving as well. There were some other benefits that arose as well, and this is an interesting observation, because whilst we might focus on the business as such, and also we've got our technology in place and we've got business continuity plans in place to ensure that we can keep delivering to the clients if this happens or somebody's out of action, there was a great impact, I think. And if you live in a city like Bangkok, the commute times are horrendous for some people, and one of the big benefits from a environmental, social and governance point of view was putting aside the carbon footprint of not incurring more environmental damage, was that people had more time with their families. And we're talking sometimes, 3 hours to 4 hours a day more that you're spending without a commute. Now, obviously, you're at home the whole time working now as well too. So that was actually an interesting outcome. So there is a risk that I've also seen on the other side, and engaging with some of our people is saying it's hard to cut off from work, for example. That's something we'll talk about a little bit as well. You can have other risks that emerge as a result. But whilst companies didn't necessarily formally change their ESG governance or the ESG policies, they actually recognised that there were some benefits here, which is going to get them to refocus. Now, in APAC, it was around 38% recognising that a refocus was required, and globally it was closer to 47%. So something that's come out that I think was useful. So where to from here? Basically, it's pushed companies to reevaluate their risk management frameworks. The things that you might want to be considering here will be around, what are the lessons you have learned? How well did your risk management framework actually interact with your effective decision making? Was there a good connect? How well did you identify and respond to the risks? And how effective was your business continuity? What extent can technology be used as well to do better predictive analysis? And Sean was just mentioning that. We're saying, well, we look at the risks as are, or whatever they might be. What's the future look like? What are we looking at in the next year or 2 years and things like that? What are the fallouts? The initial responses tend to be around, okay, we need to keep operating. We need to, next thing, make sure the people are okay. Next thing is, what's the impact, for example, on the economy and things like that? What's the future impacts that we now need to be evaluating, which I will talk around as well. The report actually does talk about an effective chief risk officer, or certainly someone who's got a prime role within an organisation to ensure that you're focused on gathering risk and ensuring good analysis is being undertaken throughout the business. Risks are owned throughout the business. They're not owned by that individual. But again, having it as a front and centre role is something that the report identified as a potential thing that you need to think about. Looking forward, some changing risk concerns to APAC, and this is some of the observations from the report as well, that failure to innovate or to meet the customer needs became a much bigger issue as a result of the pandemic. 48% realised, hang on a minute, if we don't innovate and we're at risk of not meeting our customer needs because we're in a new environment, we've got real trouble on our hands. And that shifted from about 19% the year before up to about 48%, a dramatic increase in concern. Which is interesting. If I was going to, what's the heart of your business, should be about customer needs and innovation, and why all of a sudden did it get a big increase? It was a threat. So maybe there's a lesson learned there to say that should always be something that you're doing. Rising competition, okay? Because if your competitors are being more innovative, that they're being more adaptable, they're being able to respond better in these sort of environments, could become a bigger concern for you. So executives, again, similar sort of statistics, 20% in 2020 worried about the competitors, up to 48%. They must have been looking at going, hang on, these guys are adapting better than we are. Economic slowdown is one of the big ones that I think particularly, I would say, Thailand was impacted largely in terms of the tourist industry, but now we could have much wider spread impacts as a result. Now, the tourist industry was very important, and it actually has a lot of things that fall off that, but we're now into this new extended period. Now, what does that mean, and what's the impact? What does that mean from a competitive point of view in terms of how you need to respond? Then also computer crime I should talk about, and I did mention that before, was that we're all in the cloud. We've got all new technology, or some of us have had it, others have moved to it. Now, keep in mind, you've now got a new exposure that you need to manage. So again, what are you doing around that now? So these are areas that you should be really focused and thinking about, I think, in in the future. Sean, I might just get you to add something to that as well.
Yeah, so just quickly, I think you're going to find that digital transformations are going to continue, probably with the development of some new operating models too, given the lessons learned from COVID. And I think you'll be seeing a lot of businesses looking at their supply chain to say, well, we can't just rely on one or two suppliers. We may have to actually diversify and have a number of them, just to make sure that they can keep supply going.
So as a final reflection, so basically, one of the key lessons from the pandemic that the report does talk about, and we've witnessed personally, I guess, is the importance of agility, the rapid and effective decision-making, and also empowerment of your people were the key things that highlight success. And I would say take that forward too into what we're facing at the moment. But if you think about it, these should be the fundamentals of your business anyway. We talk about it, but when you were forced into the situation, it made it more apparent of how important those sort of things are as well. Take the opportunity to get better at managing risk. This is a great opportunity to sort of, okay, we've got to look at these things. How can we get better at predicting? How can we get better at analysis and planning? Review testing. So do you test your responses? So business continuity planning is a classic. We might have a business continuity plan, but are we testing it? And is it going to work if things go bad? That gives you a foundation then to be agile. And then you can approach the change with confidence. We often say, risks, the flip side of risk is opportunity. And we're seeing that a lot through the pandemic over the last year or two, where certain companies have risen to go, well, actually, we've been able to adapt very well and we're going strong, and others that could not adapt as well and they're falling by the wayside. We've still got a journey to go, and it's important that we take this opportunity to really think forward, but do it with confidence and take the opportunity. I think as a takeaway too is look after your people. They're central to what you do. Make sure you do empower them. Make sure you provide them what they need and the support. And then have a very good, solid, not only an employee assistance program around them, which I think is something we need to think about to ensure their welfare is looked after and that going forward, but also have a solid business continuity planning around all aspects of your business, including people. So that's it from me. I don't know if there's any final words from you, Sean.
Yeah, so I agree totally what you said, Peter. And I think that from my perspective, the well-being of your employees is really important, because people being locked up in a unit, the walls can start closing in before they know it, and they can start getting, mental health issues. But also in terms of the technology side, a lot of businesses are actually outsourcing their technology and a lot of their processes. But what I've found is when I'm doing a lot of third-party assurance work, where businesses still own the risk, right, but it's being managed by another organization, is the organizations that they're actually asking to manage their risk or their processes for them are actually not that well defined. So we're finding a lot of organizations that are just running, by the seat of their pants, basically, that they have to go through an organizational change themselves. So they're probably an accident waiting to happen if businesses don't start looking at what have we outsourced that we're still responsible for? Are the organizations we've outsourced to managing our risks as we need to? Otherwise, that could become an issue in itself in the future.
No worries. So, look, thank you for that. On that note, thank you everyone for your time today, and I hope you found that enlightening.
So thank you, Peter and Sean. We have a question from Andrew Lawrence. Andrew says, technology is quite a broad term. Are you able to provide some examples of new technology, excluding COVID tracking apps, that has been developed to assist with logistics companies to work more effectively in APAC under COVID?
That's a good question, and I can't at this point, but I'm just making a note of that, because that could be something we can come back to you on.
Yeah, it is a good question. And I'm just racking my brain, because I know a lot of retail, a lot of businesses are actually using like click and collect technology, so that it reduces the need for the customers to go to the shop, but it probably is not exactly the technology you're talking about. But you could see that linking back to supply chain to say, well, if I'm ordering and I'm doing click and collect, it has to automatically link back to say, well, is it available and can I get it within a certain time frame?
So really, we're looking at Now, what's happened in the logistics area in terms of some of the evolving technology there that's really helped in terms of tracking and ensuring that your supply chain's still working. And so as I say, I'm personally not aware, but let me come back and I'll get back to you, Andrew, on that one as well. We'll cast the net out a little wider and just see what sort of things have happened in that space, because obviously we can dip into people, my other partners within Thailand, as well as the network wider. We'll have people who've got expertise in that. So I'll get back via you, Brendan.
Yes, I can introduce Andrew to both Peter and Sean by email. We have a second question from Dr. Anachar. It can be anticipated there will be more independent workers. How should the present welfare system or company system be adjusted?
Okay, so that's a very good question, actually. So one thing we're considering, so for example, we're talking here the welfare of people. So the harsh reality is that there's going to be an increase in not just severe illness, but potentially deaths and of family members, but even staff. So what do you do then to respond to that? And I know in Thailand, traditionally, there's certain things that we would do in terms of compassionate leave, in terms of finance support for the families, for the funeral. So that's sort of what has been traditionally done, but can you go further? Can you redefine, for example, the sort of compassionate leave that might be required, because you might have multiple family members that are affected, and we've seen that in close family members. So providing the people the time they need to deal with their families. There could be even the caring factor. Now, we found in Thailand, for example, people trying to find hospitals for their parents because there's run out of hospitals that they can go to. So being able to pick up medical supplies. So whatever support we can do there. There's vaccination programs, obviously, and that's something I know we've done ourselves, and it hasn't been easy for people to get vaccinations. So we've been, and many other companies as well. So they're the sort of things. I think there's a carer's leave potentially as well, because we don't know the long-term effects of COVID on older people, for even if they do survive. So something to think about. So they're the sort of things that, as a company, you could be starting to have conversations around to say, how do we best place ourselves to support our people going forward?
Thanks, Peter. I have one more question. We're out of time, but I have a question I think can apply to a lot of the smaller businesses. You mentioned about companies appointing a chief risk officer moving forward, and how critical a position like that would be for organisations. What about for smaller organisations that wouldn't have the capacity for a single position to have a chief risk officer? Where would it come? Would it be under the general management position, under another one of the senior people? Where would you put that risk officer position in an organisation?
Sure. I think with a smaller organisation, it typically, and we are talking smaller, would typically be a fundamental role of the CEO. But you would see that the CEO ultimately, in a very large organisation, has a responsibility for this as well, but they have a chief risk officer to support them effectively. So in a smaller organisation, you would see that the CEO should probably do that. Now, they might need some help. This is typically where we would be providing some help and insights and support for your small to medium enterprises to go, here's the sort of things you need to be doing, because they don't necessarily have access to the tools and the technology and the expertise, but that's where it would sort of fall in. It's a bit like saying, well, with legal advice, I need to get a lawyer to provide me some advice on things. I'm the CEO. I don't have an in-house counsel, or it could be the same in tax or whatever, but risk is the same sort of thing. You can say, but you need some support in that area. And some CEOs are brilliant at doing it. They've got the right background experience, or naturally are very good at it. But that's where you need to go, is to say, it would lie with that person if they need support to run things past or more, then they can actually go to getting some expertise to support them as an advisor, not as, you don't outsource that function. That's an internal function, but you outsource the support potentially, or get advice in to support you.
So if anyone does have any questions, they can contact Peter and Sean for Thailand and Australia, of course, BDO offices across all of APAC as well. So,
No worries.
Peter Sheville, Sean Pascoe, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank
And
you.
look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. See you later, everybody.
Okay.